I never thought a family dinner could change my life forever. One moment, I was laughing at my little brother's ridiculous joke, and the next, I was gasping for air, clutching my ribs while he stood there smirking. My parents didn't care. They just told me to walk it off. But when the ER doctor examined me and immediately called the police, I realized this wasn't just a family argument. It was something much darker. My name is Hannah Caldwell, and this is the story of how my own brother broke me, my parents ignored it, and how a stranger's intervention finally brought the truth to light. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It all started in the small, sun-soaked town of Greenville, Ohio, where I'd grown up in a house that looked picture-perfect from the outside. White picket fences, freshly mown lawns, and a family who smiled for holiday photos. But behind closed doors, the veneer of perfection barely held back tension that had been simmering for years. I had always been a quiet, bookish type, the kind of person who preferred reading in the corner over joining in on family wrestling matches or sports in the yard. My younger brother, Lucas, was the exact opposite. Boisterous, mischievous, and a natural thrill seeker. He had this energy that could light up a room, but it could just as easily turn into aggression. And over the years, I'd learned to avoid his unpredictable outbursts whenever possible. That afternoon, it started like any other Sunday. Mom was in the kitchen, fussing over meatloaf. Dad was in his recliner, half watching the football game. And Lucas was bouncing around like a pinball, trying to get me to join a silly challenge he'd invented involving jumping over the couch. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "I don't think so, Lucas," I said, my voice timid but firm. He grinned, that cocky smirk I hated, and ignored me. He launched himself at the couch anyway, and in a move that seemed like a game to him, he collided with me mid-step. I felt a sharp, crushing pain in my ribs before I even realized what had happened. The air hushed out of me, and I collapsed onto the carpet, my hands clutching my side. I couldn't breathe properly, and the pain radiated through my torso like fire. "Walk it off," my father said casually from across the room, not even looking up from the game. "You'll be fine, Hannah. Stop overreacting." My mother, standing in the kitchen, merely sighed and told me to calm down. "Lucas didn't mean anything by it," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Go sit down. It's probably just a bruise." I wanted to scream, to make them see the agony etched on my face, but they didn't care. I had learned over the years that complaints didn't count in our family. They were brushed aside, minimized, or turned back on me as if I was the one causing trouble. I tried to stand, wincing with every movement, but the pain was unbearable. My vision blurred, and for the first time, I felt a creeping panic. Something inside me knew this wasn't a simple bruise or a minor accident. My ribs felt crushed, every breath like shards of glass in my chest. Lucas, oblivious, leaned over and teased, "Come on, sis, it's just a joke. Don't be such a drama queen." I felt a surge of frustration mixed with fear. I couldn't believe my own family could be so blind, so uncaring about what just happened to me. I had no idea how serious it really was, but instinct screamed that I needed help beyond our living room. After a few minutes, I managed to shuffle to the phone in the hallway, my body trembling and sweat beading on my forehead. I hesitated. Dad's disapproval always lingered, a silent shadow over my actions. But finally, I dialed our local emergency number. The operator's calm voice was almost comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos of my home. I explained what had happened, my voice shaking so badly that I could barely get the words out. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived, and the EMTs moved quickly, assessing my injuries with professional detachment. They lifted me onto a stretcher, carefully positioning me to minimize pain, and as they rolled me out of the house, I caught a fleeting glimpse of Lucas leaning in the doorway, smirking at what he probably thought was just another dramatic moment of mine. The ride to Greenville General Hospital was a blur of sirens, beeping monitors, and muffled reassurances from the EMTs. I tried to tell them about my parents' reaction, how they didn't believe me and dismissed what happened, but the words felt hollow, as if no one would understand the mix of fear, betrayal, and anger swirling inside me. At the ER, the doctor's expression changed the moment she examined me. She gently touched my ribs, then stepped back, frowning. "These are not minor bruises," she said, her voice firm but caring. "Someone needs to know what happened here, and it sounds like you're not being protected at home." My stomach dropped. The words I had feared, calling the police, involving authorities, were now a reality.
That night, I lay in the hospital bed, propped up on pillows, feeling the weight of everything. Lucas, my parents, our seemingly perfect family, their smiles, the routines, the facade of normalcy, all shattered in an instant. I was no longer just the quiet kid in the corner. I was someone who had been hurt, ignored, and finally acknowledged by a stranger who cared more about my safety than my own family. I didn't know what the next days would bring, what my brother or parents would say, or how life would change. But something inside me shifted. I realized I could no longer stay silent, could no longer accept being dismissed or harmed under the guise of family loyalty. And that's where my story truly begins. The day I realized that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones who fail, and that help can come from the most unexpected places. The morning after the ER visit, I woke up with a dull, relentless ache in my side, a constant reminder that what happened was real and serious. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft hum of monitors and the occasional footsteps of nurses checking vitals. I tried to shift slightly, gingerly testing whether the pain had lessened, but each movement sent sharp jolts through my ribs. Sitting up fully was impossible, and even breathing deeply felt like an exercise in courage. Yet, amid the discomfort, a part of me felt strangely relieved. For the first time, someone who wasn't my family, was taking me seriously. The ER doctor's words from last night echoed in my mind. Someone needs to know what happened here. I had spent so many years tiptoeing around the volatile dynamics of my home, learning to keep quiet, that this acknowledgement, even from a stranger, felt revolutionary. When the nurse brought in breakfast, I barely touched it. My stomach churned, not just from nerves, but from the emotional whirlwind of the day before. I could feel the reality settling in. Lucas hadn't been disciplined at home. My parents had brushed off what he did, and yet now the authorities might get involved. It was a strange mixture of fear and empowerment. I thought about my mother's casual shrug, her insistence that I walk it off, and my father's dismissive stare as if my pain was an overreaction. That same mother and father had always insisted on maintaining appearances in front of friends and neighbors, never letting anyone see the cracks in our so-called perfect household. Now the cracks weren't just visible, they were undeniable. By mid-morning, a police officer arrived at my bedside, a tall woman with calm eyes and a clipboard in hand. She introduced herself as Officer Karen Dalton and explained she had been called by the hospital. Her presence was intimidating, but not in a threatening way, more like a shield I didn't know I needed. She asked me to recount what had happened, and I did, voice trembling at first, but gaining strength as I spoke. I described the incident with Lucas, the pain, and the dismissive reaction from my parents. I told her about the times he had pushed me, shoved me, or pranked me in ways that hurt both physically and emotionally, and how my parents had always told me to ignore it. As I spoke, Officer Dalton nodded, occasionally jotting notes. I felt an odd sense of validation. For once, I wasn't being dismissed. Someone was listening. Someone was believing me. Meanwhile, my parents arrived at the hospital, faces a mixture of concern and irritation. Mom's hair was still perfectly styled, Dad's tie slightly askew from rushing over. I could sense the tension instantly. Their eyes darted from me to Officer Dalton and back again. I felt a pang of anxiety. What would they say? Would they defend Lucas, try to downplay it, or worse, blame me for making a fuss? Sure enough, my mother approached me, voice tight but controlled. "Hannah, honey, you're overreacting. Lucas didn't mean to hurt you," she said, placing a hand on my arm. I flinched at the touch. The pain in my ribs sent a sharp reminder through my body. I pulled away, summoning a courage I didn't even know I had. "Mom, it's not overreacting. He broke my ribs," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "And you told me to walk it off."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. My father interjected with a defensive tone, his face reddening. "She's exaggerating, officer. Kids get rough sometimes. It's not a big deal." But Officer Dalton's eyes remained focused on me. "We'll rely on medical reports and witness statements," she said evenly, turning slightly toward my parents. "It's not up to me to judge, but it is my job to ensure the victim's safety and the law is followed." I felt a swell of relief and pride. I was finally being heard, and my truth had weight beyond my family's denial. The next hours were a whirlwind. Statements were taken, medical records were copied, and Lucas was nowhere to be found. I was left in the hospital room to rest, but my mind raced. I thought about what this would mean for my home life. Would my parents be angry at me? Would Lucas come after me in retaliation? The thought made my chest tighten even more. But alongside the fear was an unexpected sense of agency. For the first time, I understood that speaking up wasn't just about me. It was about setting boundaries, about showing that being harmed and ignored by those you trust is unacceptable. Later that afternoon, the doctor came back to check on me. She examined my side again, grimacing slightly. "Hannah, you have 3 fractured ribs. This isn't minor, and you need to rest and avoid any physical stress for at least 6 weeks. Also, I filed a report with the police because of the family dynamic you described." Hearing her use the word fractured made my stomach drop. I had known the pain was serious, but hearing it confirmed scientifically, officially, made the situation even more real. And yet, hearing that a professional had intervened made me feel safer, like I wasn't entirely alone in this fight. As the day wore on, I began to reflect on everything that had led to this moment. The teasing, the escalating aggression, the countless times I had been told to ignore it. All of it added up to this breaking point. I realized that for years I had been living under a shadow, tiptoeing around my brother's moods, placating my parents' desire for control, and pretending everything was normal. But the ER, the doctor, and Officer Dalton had opened a crack in that shadow, showing me that protection could come from outside and that I didn't have to carry this alone. It was frightening, but also empowering in a way I had never experienced. By evening, the hospital room was quiet again. I lay back against the pillows, exhausted but alert, feeling the ache in my side and the unfamiliar stirrings of confidence in my chest. The day had been terrifying and painful, yet transformative. Something had shifted. Not just the recognition of the injury, but the recognition of my right to be safe and believed. My parents may not have understood, Lucas may not have cared, but strangers had. And in that realization, a seed of hope began to grow, faint but undeniable, that life might not always be about keeping secrets or enduring harm silently, but about standing up and letting the truth be known.
The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the bedside table. The text notification was from Officer Dalton. We need to schedule a follow-up interview today at the station. Nothing to worry about, just part of the process. My stomach churned. Part of me was relieved that the situation was being handled, but another part felt a wave of dread. Visiting the police station meant facing questions, recounting every painful detail, and confronting the fact that my family might not stand behind me. I sat up slowly, careful not to aggravate my ribs, and tried to collect my thoughts. Each movement sent a jolt through my chest, a constant reminder of how close I had come to serious injury. I dressed slowly in loose hospital pajamas, feeling the heaviness of the day ahead. By mid-morning, Officer Dalton arrived to take me to the Greenville police station. She was calm, professional, and reassuring, and she helped me into her car. The ride was short, but the silence between us was filled with unspoken questions. I thought about Lucas and my parents, wondering how they had reacted after learning that law enforcement had been notified. My mother's expressions had shifted throughout the hospital visit, first concern, then exasperation, then subtle anger. My father's jaw had been tight, his posture rigid, as if the very concept of accountability was foreign to him. I felt a small surge of fear at the thought of the confrontation to come, but I also felt a spark of determination. I had endured his dismissals, her minimizations, and my brother's aggression long enough. Now it was time for my voice to be heard outside the confines of our home.
At the police station, I was led into a small, sterile interview room. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, and the walls were painted a pale beige that seemed to absorb the tension in the air. Officer Dalton sat across from me and placed a folder in front of her. "Hannah, I'm going to ask you to go over everything that happened yesterday. Take your time and answer honestly. If anything is unclear, just tell me. We'll make sure your statement is accurate," she said. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. The folder contained preliminary reports from the ER, my initial statement, and notes from the EMTs. Seeing the documentation made the incident feel both more official and more intimidating. I began recounting the events, starting with the ordinary Sunday afternoon that had turned into a nightmare. I described Lucas's challenge, the moment he collided with me, and the searing pain that followed. I explained my parents' reactions, their dismissive attitudes, and the repeated history of ignoring my complaints. Each word felt like lifting a weight off my chest. The more I spoke, the more I realized how much I had internalized over the years. The shame, the fear, and the constant self-doubt. For so long, I had questioned my own perceptions, convinced that maybe I was exaggerating, that maybe I was too sensitive. But the documentation in front of me, the validation from medical professionals, and Officer Dalton's attentive presence were proof that my experiences were real and important. As I finished, Officer Dalton asked if there had been previous incidents of aggression. I hesitated, remembering the countless times Lucas had shoved me, pushed me into walls, or cornered me in ways that made me afraid to move freely in my own home. I detailed those moments, describing the escalating nature of his behavior and the frustration of having my parents dismiss it every time. She nodded thoughtfully, making notes in her folder, occasionally glancing up to reassure me. "Thank you, Hannah. This is important. The more details we have, the clearer the situation becomes," she said. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions I was feeling. Fear, anxiety, relief, and a growing sense of agency all tangled together. After a while, the door opened and another officer brought in a recording device to make a formal statement. My hands shook as I adjusted my position, careful not to aggravate the pain in my ribs. Speaking for an official record felt daunting, but it also felt powerful. Each word I spoke, each detail I shared was a step toward reclaiming control over my life. It was as if the very act of telling my story in a structured, undeniable way began to push back against the years of dismissal and neglect I had endured. I felt a mixture of vulnerability and strength, a strange paradox that left me exhausted yet determined. The formal recording took longer than I expected, stretching over an hour. By the end, my voice was hoarse, my ribs throbbed, and my body ached from tension and pain, but I also felt a flicker of pride. I had done something I had never done before. I had documented my own truth, making it visible to others who had the power to act. As Officer Dalton escorted me out of the interview room, she placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did really well, Hannah. This is a crucial step in making sure your safety is prioritized. We'll follow up with your parents and Lucas next," she said. I nodded, a mixture of apprehension and cautious hope swirling inside me. Driving back to the hospital to rest, I reflected on the day's events. The realization hit me that life as I knew it was shifting. My family, once an unquestionable authority, was now being scrutinized, held accountable in ways they had never faced before. And me? I was no longer just the quiet sibling hiding in the corner. I was a witness to my own life, and I was learning for the first time that my perspective mattered, that my pain mattered, and standing up, though terrifying, was the only way forward. The journey was far from over, but the first steps toward reclaiming my life had been taken, and I could feel, faintly but undeniably, the weight of fear beginning to lift, replaced by a fragile, growing sense of courage. By the time I returned home from the police station, the house felt heavier than ever. The sunlight that usually streamed through the windows seemed muted, as if even the walls themselves had sensed the tension now lingering in the air. I moved cautiously, each step sent jolts through my ribs, and I couldn't help but notice the silence. It wasn't peaceful, no. It was the silence of people waiting, of people calculating their next move. My parents were in the living room, sitting stiffly on the couch, avoiding eye contact as though acknowledging my presence might somehow make the situation more real. Lucas was nowhere to be seen, and the absence of his usual boisterous energy felt ominous. I realized that my family, who had dismissed me for so long, were now the ones on edge. The dynamic had shifted, and I could feel it in every glance, every pause in conversation.
"Mom? Dad?" I began, but my voice cracked and I hesitated. My mother looked up first, her face carefully neutral, while my father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. They were clearly processing what had happened at the police station, though neither had spoken a word yet. The silence stretched, unbearable and heavy, until my father finally broke it. "Hannah, are you sure this is necessary? Can't we just handle this ourselves?" His voice was tense, defensive, and I could hear the underlying fear in it. That fear of accountability, fear of exposure, was something I had never seen before in him. I swallowed hard, gathering the strength that had been building inside me for days. "No, Dad," I said firmly, "this isn't something we can just sweep under the rug. What happened to me was serious, and it needs to be addressed properly." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "Hannah, Lucas is your brother. He didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her tone pleading, almost as if she were trying to convince herself more than me. But I could see the cracks in her words, the way her hand trembled slightly as it rested on her knee. "He broke my ribs, Mom. Not bruised them, not scared me a little. Broke them. And you told me to walk it off." "That's not okay," I said, my voice stronger than I anticipated. For the first time, I wasn't begging for understanding. I was stating a fact that could no longer be denied. I could see a flicker of panic cross both their faces, the realization that the facade of normalcy they had maintained for years was beginning to crumble. Lucas finally appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with that same smirk I despised. "Really, Hannah? Police and doctors now? You're making a mountain out of nothing." I stared at him, feeling a surge of anger mixed with fear. "Nothing?" I echoed. "You broke me, Lucas. You hurt me, and you didn't even care. And Mom, Dad, you just ignored it." The words had weight now. They were no longer whispered complaints or private frustrations. They were accusations backed by medical reports, police statements, and undeniable truth. Lucas's smirk faltered slightly, replaced by something I couldn't immediately read,
maybe surprise, maybe guilt, maybe the realization that this time I wasn't backing down. Over the next few hours, tension mounted as my parents tried to negotiate, to find some way to downplay the situation, to frame it as a misunderstanding. I stood firm, refusing to retreat, even as every nerve in my body ached. The pain in my ribs was a constant reminder of the stakes, but it also fueled my resolve. Officer Dalton had explained earlier that day that once a formal report was filed, the case would proceed independently of parental opinion, and I clung to that knowledge like a lifeline. I wasn't alone, and my truth mattered. I began to realize, too, that the real shift wasn't just in what I had done, calling the police, speaking out, but in the way I felt about myself. I had been silenced for so long, conditioned to believe that my feelings didn't matter, that my safety wasn't a priority. Now, speaking up felt less like defiance and more like reclamation. That evening, I received a call from Officer Dalton letting me know that social services would be following up with my family and that my statement had been filed officially. Hearing her voice, calm and reassuring, reminded me that even if my parents or Lucas resisted the truth, there were structures in place to protect me. A strange mix of fear and relief coursed through me. I worried about the backlash, Lucas's anger, my parents' disappointment, but at the same time, I felt a clarity I had never experienced before. I could no longer ignore the reality. The old ways of surviving in my family's shadows were over. I had begun a process of accountability that neither they nor I could reverse. Late that night, as I lay in bed, propped up with pillows, the pain in my ribs throbbing in rhythm with my heartbeat, I reflected on the day's events. The confrontation with my family had been intense and emotionally exhausting, yet it had also revealed cracks in the armor I had once believed to be impenetrable. Lucas was no longer untouchable, my parents could no longer dismiss the severity of what happened, and I was learning that truth had power. The hospital, the police, the medical evidence, they were all allies in a system I had never imagined I could rely on. For the first time, I felt a tentative sense of hope that speaking out might not only protect me, but also start to reshape the dynamics of my family.
As I drifted into a fitful sleep, I realized that the days ahead would be difficult. There would be resistance, anger, and perhaps even attempts to undermine my story. But I also knew that the process had begun, that the first steps toward justice and self-protection were already underway. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of control over my own narrative, a sense that I could no longer be invisible or dismissed. The path would be long and painful, but it was the first path I had ever truly chosen for myself. And with that, I closed my eyes, letting exhaustion and determination mingle, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. The days following the hospital discharge were a strange mixture of relief, pain, and mounting tension. My ribs throbbed constantly, a relentless reminder of the attack and the fragility of my body. Yet the emotional weight of what had happened was just as difficult to bear. Officer Dalton had reassured me multiple times that I had done the right thing, that my safety and truth mattered more than maintaining a facade of family loyalty. But returning home, even briefly, felt like stepping into a battlefield I had no armor for. Lucas's presence was suffocating, and every glance from my parents seemed to carry judgment, frustration, or resentment. I tried to focus on resting, to follow the doctor's instructions, but peace was elusive when the undercurrent of tension was so thick I could almost see it pressing against my skin. I spent the first morning back in my room, wrapped in blankets and leaning against pillows, my body protesting every shift and movement. The pain in my ribs wasn't just physical, it was the constant echo of betrayal and dismissal, a reminder that the people who were supposed to protect me hadn't. My thoughts kept returning to Officer Dalton's words. The more details we have, the clearer the situation becomes.
I realized that more details meant not just recounting events, but observing patterns, documenting evidence, and preparing to defend myself in ways I had never needed before. For the first time, I understood that asserting the truth wasn't just about words, it was about actions, documentation, and resilience. By the afternoon, a social worker from Greenville Child Protective Services arrived. Her presence added another layer of reality to the situation. I had never imagined anyone outside my family would step in, and her calm professionalism was both reassuring and intimidating. She introduced herself as Marissa Hayes and explained that her job was to ensure that my safety and well-being were protected and to assess the home environment. As she spoke with my parents in the living room, I stayed in my room, quietly listening. I could hear snippets of conversation, the occasional raised voice, a sharp retort, the kind of defensive statements I had come to expect from both my mother and father. But Marissa remained steady, her questions precise, her tone unwavering. After a while, Marissa called me into the living room. I moved slowly, wincing with every step, but determined to participate. She sat me down and asked me to describe again what happened with Lucas, the history of aggression, and my parents' responses over the years. Speaking aloud in the presence of both a social worker and my parents felt different from the hospital or police station. This was personal, immediate, and intimate. Yet I spoke, recounting moments that had previously existed only in my memory as silent, painful experiences. Every word I spoke was met with careful note-taking, and for the first time, I felt a sense of formal acknowledgement of my suffering. Marissa's calm demeanor allowed me to feel seen, and in that presence, my fear began to shift into cautious confidence. Lucas, who had been leaning against the doorway with a sarcastic smirk, suddenly straightened up as I detailed the pattern of aggression he had inflicted over the years. My parents, too, reacted subtly, their faces pale and tense. My mother's attempts to soften the narrative with phrases like, "he didn't mean it," fell flat under the scrutiny of formal questioning. My father's defensive posture shifted to one of discomfort, as if the reality of repeated harm could no longer be denied. The past that my family had buried under a layer of indifference and routine was now being examined under a spotlight of accountability. By the evening, the social worker had gathered enough information to outline the next steps: follow-up visits, continued documentation of injuries, and the potential for protective measures if the environment at home proved unsafe. Officer Dalton called later that night to check on me and confirmed that the formal processes were moving forward. Hearing her voice brought a sense of stability that contrasted sharply with the unpredictable emotions swirling inside my home. I realized that for the first time, there were adults outside my immediate family whose priority was my safety, and that realization gave me an unexpected strength.
As I lay back against my pillows, my ribs aching, I thought about the implications of the day. The confrontation with my family had been subtle yet intense. They were no longer in complete control of the narrative. Lucas, my once untouchable brother, had been observed and questioned about his behavior. My parents, who had so often minimized and dismissed me, now had to contend with a reality they could not ignore. And me, I was no longer a passive participant in my life's story. Every detail I shared, every moment of bravery and recounting my experiences was building a foundation of truth, evidence, and empowerment that I had never known before. Sleep came fitfully that night, punctuated by aches in my ribs and a mind racing with worry, relief, and determination. I thought about the future, the potential legal steps, the possible interventions, and the hard conversations that still lay ahead. Yet, despite the fear, there was a glimmer of hope. I had survived the initial wave of disbelief, taken my first steps toward justice, and begun to reclaim a voice that had long been silenced. And with that fragile but growing sense of courage, I finally allowed my eyes to close, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also the possibility of change, protection, and acknowledgement that had once seemed impossible. By the middle of the week, the situation began to take on a clarity that both terrified and reassured me.
The hospital had forwarded my medical records to the police and social services, and both Officer Dalton and Miss Hayes, the social worker, had assured me that my statements and the objective evidence would leave little room for doubt. As I rested in my bedroom, wrapped in pillows and blankets, I received a call from Officer Dalton. She sounded serious, but calm. Hannah, the ER imaging and doctor's notes confirm multiple fractures consistent with non-accidental trauma. The case is now moving forward formally. This means your family can no longer dismiss what happened, and the authorities are involved in a way that will protect you. Hearing her words, a mixture of relief and trepidation swept over me. On one hand, I finally had undeniable proof that what I had experienced was real and consequential. On the other hand, this meant the confrontation with my family, particularly Lucas, was inevitable. That afternoon, I could hear my parents whispering in the kitchen. They were clearly aware that the evidence was irrefutable, and I realized that the dynamic in our home had shifted completely. For the first time, the illusion of their control was gone. I watched Lucas pace nervously across the living room, his usual cocky demeanor replaced with a cautious tension. It was a strange sight, seeing someone who had tormented me for years now appear uncertain and unsettled. I realized, with a quiet satisfaction, that the scales had begun to tip. Truth, once hidden under layers of denial and indifference, was emerging as an undeniable force, and everyone in the household had to confront it. As the night wore on, Miss Hayes stayed to outline the next steps, documenting ongoing injuries, monitoring interactions between Lucas and I, and working with law enforcement to ensure a protective plan was in place. The gravity of the situation settled over the household, a weight that I could feel in every glance and every unspoken word. Yet beneath the tension, I sensed something else, a quiet validation. For years, I had been silenced, dismissed, and overlooked. Now the system was aligned with me, recognizing my suffering and demanding accountability from those who had harmed me. The shift was profound. I was no longer invisible, and the truth could no longer be hidden.
That night, lying in my bedroom with the pain in my ribs throbbing softly as I drifted between sleep and wakefulness, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The confrontation with my family had been inevitable, but it was only possible because of the undeniable evidence and the intervention of professionals who believed in me. For the first time, I felt a sense of clarity about my own strength, about the power of truth to break through years of neglect and denial. I realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the willingness to act despite it. By speaking up, by allowing the medical documentation and police involvement to formalize my experience, I had claimed agency over my own life in a way I never thought possible. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in the household. Lucas avoided unnecessary contact, his previously brash attitude replaced by a cautious wariness. My parents spoke less, their attempts to assert authority weakened by the knowledge that their actions, or inactions, were now under scrutiny. I felt a quiet sense of power in this shift, but also a sobering awareness that the path ahead would be challenging. The process of accountability was ongoing, and the tension was far from resolved. Still, the undeniable proof of my injuries had marked a turning point, a point at which denial could no longer prevail, and the truth had begun to assert itself in the lives of everyone involved. By the end of that week, I felt a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and a budding sense of empowerment. The physical pain in my ribs remained, but it was accompanied now by the emotional weight of recognition and validation. I had survived the initial wave of disbelief, gathered evidence, and asserted my voice in ways that had previously seemed impossible. And in that realization, I found the first hints of hope, a hope that truth, courage, and persistence could break through even the most entrenched patterns of denial and abuse. That hope, fragile but undeniable, would carry me forward into the next stage of the story, a stage where confrontation, choice, and accountability would continue to shape the path ahead. The morning after the major revelation, I awoke with a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest.
The past week had shifted everything I believed about my family, my own power, and the reality of my life, but the consequences of speaking up were beginning to hit me in full force. My ribs throbbed, a constant physical reminder of Lucas's aggression, yet it was the emotional toll that weighed heaviest on me now. I knew that choosing to assert the truth fully, to demand accountability, was going to provoke reactions that I could not control. Yet, deep down, I realized that silence was no longer an option. Pretending that nothing had happened or walking the line of compliance with my parents' and brothers' expectations would only perpetuate the cycle of harm I had endured for years. By mid-morning, Lucas entered the living room, his movements tentative, eyes darting nervously as he noticed the new dynamic in the household. He no longer carried the air of unchallenged superiority that had dominated my interactions with me for years. Instead, his expression held a mixture of apprehension and irritation. "Hannah, do you really have to make this such a big deal?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but the underlying tension betrayed him. I took a deep breath, feeling the pain in my ribs with every inhalation, but the fear of confronting him had been eclipsed by a growing resolve. "Lucas," I said steadily, "this is not about exaggerating or making a scene. You broke my ribs. You hurt me, and I am not going to let this go unaddressed." The words hung in the air, solid and undeniable, and for the first time, I saw him pause, as if truly processing the gravity of his actions. My parents, who had been hovering near the doorway, exchanged anxious glances. Their previous dismissals had crumbled under the weight of evidence, and now they were confronted with the possibility that their actions, or inactions, were now under scrutiny. My mother's voice trembled slightly as she tried to interject. "Hannah, we just didn't know it was that serious." I held up my hand, cutting her off. "Mom, Dad, it doesn't matter what you think now. The truth is clear, and I need you to listen instead of minimizing. I am asking for recognition of what happened and for accountability to follow." For years, my parents had been the arbiters of reality in our household, dismissing my experiences as overreactions or fabrications. But now, with formal documentation, police involvement, and social services monitoring the situation, their authority was no longer absolute. I felt a strange mix of fear and liberation. Fear because of the unknown reactions ahead, and liberation because the truth was mine to speak, unfiltered and undeniable.
Lucas shifted uncomfortably, his usual smirk replaced by a tight-lipped expression that I had rarely seen. "I didn't mean to," he began, but I cut him off. "Intent doesn't erase the fact that I was hurt, Lucas. I have medical evidence. I have professionals watching the situation. I am not asking you to feel guilty. I am telling you the consequences of your actions are real, and they must be acknowledged." The room was silent, the tension almost tangible. For the first time, I saw the power dynamic in our family flip. I wasn't the passive, silent sibling anymore. I had stepped into a space of authority, not by force, but through truth, courage, and external validation. My parents were visibly shaken. Lucas was uneasy, and I felt a strange sense of relief even as my chest ached and my heart pounded. Later that day, Officer Dalton called to check in. She spoke in her usual calm, measured tone, asking how I was coping with the confrontation at home. I admitted that it had been emotionally exhausting, that my ribs ached, and that the tension in the house was almost unbearable. She reassured me that this was normal, that speaking up often provoked resistance and fear, especially from those who had relied on denial to maintain control. Her words were both comforting and empowering. For the first time, I felt that the consequences of speaking my truth, while daunting, were outweighed by the necessity of asserting my right to safety, acknowledgement, and dignity. As evening fell, I reflected on a choice I had made. Standing up and declaring my truth had been terrifying, yet it was transformative. I realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the ability to act despite it. Every year of dismissal, every moment of being ignored or minimized had brought me to this point. The confrontation was not over, and the path ahead would likely be filled with challenges and resistance, but the foundation of truth had been laid.
I felt a sense of agency that was entirely new, and understanding that my experiences mattered, and that I could no longer be silenced by familial authority or intimidation. By the time night fell, I had come to a quiet realization. The choice to speak my truth was not just about seeking justice for what had happened. It was about reclaiming my life, my voice, and my identity. For the first time, I felt the power of asserting my reality, the liberation that comes from refusing to be minimized, and the resilience that arises from acting even when fear and uncertainty are overwhelming. I knew that the days ahead would be difficult, that backlash, anger, and confrontation were inevitable. But the act of choosing to speak had already shifted everything. I was no longer the silent sibling hiding in the shadows. I was a witness to my own life, and I was no longer willing to let my voice be ignored. The confrontation that had been simmering finally erupted the following afternoon, a storm that swept through the house with undeniable force. Lucas's presence was impossible to ignore. He paced back and forth in the living room, each step deliberate, tension radiating from his posture. My parents hovered nearby, their expressions taut with a mix of frustration, fear, and disbelief. It felt as though the air itself had thickened, each breath weighted with anticipation. I sat upright in my recliner, careful to avoid aggravating my ribs, yet bracing for the verbal onslaught I knew was coming. The past weeks had brought the truth into light, but now it was time for the hardest test yet, the confrontation of lies, denials, and excuses head-on. Lucas's first words were sharp, defensive, and dripping with hostility. "Hannah, you've gone too far this time. Involving police and social services? This is overkill. You're making our family look like criminals." His voice reverberated through the room, each syllable an attempt to intimidate me. But something had shifted inside me. I no longer felt like the small, silent sibling who had endured his aggression for years. I had allies in the form of undeniable evidence, professionals who had validated my experience, and a growing understanding of my own worth. I met his days steadily. "Lucas, this isn't about appearances or embarrassment. This is about reality. I was hurt, badly. My injuries are documented, and the authorities are involved because that's the proper response to what you did." My words seemed to hang in the air, challenging him in a way that no quiet protest or complaint ever had. My parents attempted to intervene, their voices layered with nervous urgency. "Hannah, can't we just handle this privately?" My mother pleaded, the strain in her tone betraying her fear. My father added, "You're escalating things unnecessarily. Lucas didn't mean to hurt you." I shook my head, pain jabbing through my side with emotion, but I refused to retreat. "No," I said clearly, "this isn't unnecessary. This isn't about intent. It's about facts. I was injured, and ignoring it is not acceptable." The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of undeniable truth pressed against their defenses. For the first time, I saw them confronted not with my words alone, but with the force of evidence, medical documentation, and law enforcement oversight.
Lucas's anger simmered, his attempts to dismiss the situation failing against the immovable presence of truth. "This is ridiculous," he spat, frustration evident in the tremor of his voice. "You're treating me like a criminal. I didn't even try to." I interrupted firmly. "Lucas, this isn't about treating you like a criminal. It's about recognizing that your actions caused serious harm. That's what this is about, and you are accountable for it." I could see his expression shift, a mixture of disbelief, fear, and perhaps grudging acknowledgement beginning to replace his usual arrogance. For the first time, he was forced to reckon with consequences in a way that could not be avoided or minimized. As the confrontation continued, the presence of social services and the ongoing documentation of the situation gave me a sense of fortified courage. I realized that the pattern of aggression, intimidation, and dismissal that had dominated my life for years could no longer be maintained. I spoke calmly but firmly, articulating instances of past abuse, the repeated attempts by my parents to silence me, and the undeniable facts of my injuries. Each statement chipped away at Lucas's defenses, at my parents' attempts to control the narrative, and at the deeply entrenched denial that had allowed harm to continue unchecked for years.
The tension in the room escalated as my parents tried to reassert authority. "Hannah, we're your parents. You have to respect the family," my father said, voice tight with desperation. But the irony of his words wasn't lost on me. Respect is earned, I thought, and it cannot coexist with repeated harm and dismissal. I held my ground. Respect is mutual, I said. You respect my safety and my rights. You acknowledge the harm done. That's the minimum. Everything else comes after that. I could see his expression shift, a mixture of uncertainty in my parents' faces. For the first time, they were forced to confront the consequences of protecting Lucas's behavior over my well-being. Hours seemed to stretch as the confrontation unfolded. Lucas's anger remained, but it was tempered now by caution. My parents' attempts to manipulate the situation faltered under the weight of concrete proof and persistent truth-telling. And I, despite the pain in my ribs and the exhaustion of emotional strain, felt a sense of empowerment that I had never experienced. Speaking my truth, facing intimidation head-on, and refusing to be silenced had shifted the balance in the household. It wasn't over yet. Backlash and tension were far from gone, but the scales had definitively moved in my favor. By late evening, the confrontation subsided, leaving behind a tense but undeniable clarity. Lucas had been confronted with the consequences of his actions, my parents were forced to face the impact of their inaction, and I felt a sense of validation that went beyond relief. I had endured, articulated, and confronted, and in doing so, I had claimed a form of authority in my own life that had been denied to me for too long. The road ahead would still be challenging, but the confrontation had crystallized a truth that could no longer be denied. The cycle of silence and dismissal was broken, and I had begun to reclaim my life, voice, and agency. The days following the confrontation were not the relief I had hoped for. They were a storm of emotional backlash that left me feeling battered in ways my ribs hadn't yet managed. Although the undeniable truth had been established and Lucas had been confronted, the repercussions of speaking out began to hit me in full force. My parents' frustration, previously muted under disbelief, turned into anger directed squarely at me. Every small comment, every glance felt loaded with judgment. My mother would mutter under her breath, "You've ruined everything," while my father's sighs carried the weight of disappointment, as though my insistence on being heard was a personal betrayal. Even though I knew I had done the right thing, the emotional cost was heavier than I had anticipated. The protective validation of police and social services was present, yes, but the isolation at home felt suffocating. Lucas, meanwhile, oscillated between avoidance and passive aggression. He would stalk the hallway when I was trying to rest, his footsteps deliberate and threatening, and sometimes he would speak under his breath, sly comments meant to unsettle me. Every interaction became a minefield. Even as I remained resolute, the psychological weight of having to guard my own safety within my home was exhausting. There was no physical battle now, my ribs were still tender, but the war of nerves and intimidation was unrelenting. I could feel my courage being tested, stretched to the limits as each day passed, a challenge far harder than enduring the pain of the initial attack. I realized that speaking truth had unlocked a backlash I hadn't fully anticipated, and I had to prepare for the emotional storm as rigorously as I had for the physical one.
One evening, my phone rang with a call from Officer Dalton. I felt a pang of anxiety even before I answered. "Hannah, how are you holding up?" she asked, her voice calm, as if she understood the weight I was carrying. I hesitated, then admitted the truth, that my parents were angry, that Lucas's behavior had escalated subtly, and that the tension in the house was almost unbearable. She listened carefully, making notes, then reassured me, "This is a normal reaction. People often resist accountability, especially when they've been shielded from consequences for so long. But what you've done, standing up, asserting your truth, involving the proper authorities. It was necessary. You're not alone, Hannah. You have support, and there are systems in place to ensure your safety. Her words provided a small measure of comfort, but I hung up with a tight knot in my stomach. The battle at home was far from over, and I couldn't escape the emotional isolation I felt. That night, sleep came fitfully, punctuated by flashes of the confrontation and the tense expressions on my parents' faces. I thought about how long I had endured their dismissals, Lucas's aggression, and the constant feeling of being unseen and unheard. Now, speaking the truth had placed me squarely in the spotlight, exposing not only Lucas, but also the failures of my parents' protection. I had gained clarity, yes, but clarity came with an emotional toll that was heavier than I had anticipated. The house felt colder somehow, the walls bearing silent witness to the fracture lines forming in family dynamics. I realized that truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid, and that the immediate consequences, anger, resentment, and tension, were unavoidable. The following morning, I woke to find a note slipped under my bedroom door. It was for my mother. "You've made things very difficult. Think carefully about your choices." I felt a wave of sadness mixed with fear. It was a stark reminder that while the authorities could validate my truth, they could not shield me from the emotional fallout within the home. My father was more subdued, but I could sense his tension like a low hum in the air, a warning that the household atmosphere was fragile, volatile. Even as I grieved the erosion of familial support, I reminded myself of why I had spoken up. Safety, recognition, and the long-term dismantling of harmful patterns. The immediate emotional backlash, though painful, was a necessary part of that process. Throughout the day, Lucas continued his subtle campaigns of intimidation, half-spoken threats, sarcastic remarks, and deliberate encroachment on my personal space. I felt my courage being tested as never before. I had been prepared for denial and avoidance, but not for the layered, persistent hostility that arose once the truth became undeniable. Yet, amid the tension, I also noticed a quiet resilience growing inside me. Every time I refused to react with fear or submission, every time I asserted my boundaries calmly and clearly, I reinforced the notion that my voice could not be silenced. The emotional storm was relentless, but it was also shaping me, strengthening my resolve and solidifying my sense of self-worth in ways that no external validation alone could achieve. By evening, exhaustion overwhelmed me. My ribs throbbed, my mind raced, and my heart ached under the weight of emotional isolation. I sat in my room, wrapped in blankets, reflecting on the paradox of empowerment, that speaking the truth had brought both strength and vulnerability. I was no longer passive, yet I was exposed. I had agency, yet I was under emotional siege. The realization settled heavily on my chest. True courage was not just speaking out, but enduring the fallout that came with it, holding fast to one's truth even when the world around you seemed to resist and retaliate. And in that realization, I felt the faint glimmer of hope, the knowledge that enduring this dark night of the soul was a necessary prelude to transformation and vindication. The morning of the confrontation that would define the rest of my life arrived with a tension that could almost be felt in the air. I had spent the previous days gathering my strength, leaning on Officer Dalton's guidance, and reviewing all the documentation I had assembled with Miss Hayes, the social worker. My ribs still ached with every breath, but I had learned to move with care, channeling that discomfort into focus and determination. Today was the day that the truth would no longer be whispered in rooms or dismissed with evasions. Today it would be public, undeniable, and irreversible. As I walked into the living room where my parents and Lucas were waiting, the weight of every moment that had led up to this point pressed down on me, but it also reinforced my resolve. Miss Hayes arrived first, carrying a binder thick with medical reports, statements, and observations that painted a clear, irrefutable picture of the events that had unfolded. Officer Dalton followed shortly after, her presence calm but authoritative.
The room was charged with a combination of fear, anger, and anticipation. My parents avoided my gaze, but I could see the apprehension etched into every line of their faces. Lucas, pacing nervously, attempted to appear casual, but his shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. There was no smirk, no bravado. This was a confrontation he could not avoid, a reckoning he had long evaded. And I, despite the lingering pain in my ribs, felt a sense of control and purpose that I had never experienced before. I had spoken my truth. Now it was time for it to be witnessed and validated publicly. Miss Hayes began the session by outlining the facts, the injuries documented by the ER, the timeline of events, and the repeated attempts to minimize the harm I had suffered. Every detail was methodically presented, leaving no room for ambiguity or interpretation. Officer Dalton reinforced the severity of the situation, explaining the legal implications and the role of protective services in ensuring that my safety would be maintained. The combination of professional validation, objective evidence, and methodical presentation created a force that was impossible to dismiss. My parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and I could see Lucas's eyes widen slightly as he realized the magnitude of the scrutiny he now faced. When it was my turn to speak, I felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. I recounted the events as clearly and calmly as I could, describing the physical pain, the emotional trauma, and the repeated dismissals by my parents. I didn't yell, I didn't plead. I stated the facts with the quiet authority that comes from years of being silenced and finally choosing to reclaim your voice. Each word was a strike against the walls of denial and avoidance that had been built around my family. Lucas attempted a few interruptions, but Officer Dalton and Miss Hayes redirected him firmly, reminding him that this was not a negotiation or a debate. It was a presentation of truth, backed by evidence and oversight. For the first time, I realized that my voice carried weight, that it had the power to change the dynamics that had dominated my home for years. As the session continued, the tension in the room was palpable. My parents' attempts to interject were cautious, their usual strategies of minimizing or redirecting conversation ineffective against the thorough documentation and professional oversight. I could see the fear and frustration building, and I understood that they were beginning to comprehend the consequences of years of negligence and avoidance. Lucas, once untouchable, now had no mask to hide behind. Every flinch, every hesitant glance told me that he understood the seriousness of his actions in a way he never had before. The shift in the room was almost tangible. A balance of power that had long favored him was now firmly in my corner, bolstered by truth, evidence, and the authority of professionals. By mid-afternoon, the formal session concluded with a clear outline of next steps. Protective measures were to be implemented, ongoing monitoring would ensure my safety, and accountability for Lucas's actions was no longer optional. It was a necessity. My parents were instructed to comply fully with the process, their prior attempts to shield him or deny responsibility rendered obsolete by the evidence and professional involvement. The atmosphere was heavy but decisive. The truth had been presented and validated, and every participant in the room now understood that there was no turning back. I felt a sense of vindication unlike anything I had anticipated. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but I also felt an exhilaration that came from finally seeing the system align with my truth. That night, lying in bed with my ribs propped carefully against pillows, I reflected on the day. The confrontation had been intense, emotionally taxing, and at times frightening, but it had also marked a turning point. Speaking my truth, presenting evidence, and facing my parents' resistance had shifted the balance of power and ensured that my experience could no longer be ignored or minimized. I realized that courage was not just about enduring pain, it was about claiming your voice, asserting your rights, and trusting that the truth would carry weight even in the face of fear, denial, and hostility. For the first time, I felt an empowering sense of closure. The truth was finally heard, the confrontation complete, and the path forward, though still uncertain, was illuminated by justice and accountability. The days following the formal confrontation brought a cautious sense of calm that I hadn't felt in years. The protective measures recommended by social services were put into place, and the ongoing monitoring ensured that Lucas could no longer approach me in the threatening ways he had before. My parents, though still struggling with the repercussions of the truth being laid bare, were more subdued and less dismissive. The tension in the household had not vanished entirely, but the oppressive weight of secrecy, denial, and intimidation had lifted. I found myself moving through the house with a sense of cautious confidence, aware that the power dynamics had shifted and that my safety and voice were now recognized as non-negotiable. For the first time, the home felt like a space I could inhabit without constantly anticipating harm or minimizing my experiences to avoid conflict.
School life mirrored the changes at home, though in a subtler way. Friends and teachers who had previously assumed that the bruises and fatigue were minor now looked at me with a new awareness. I did not broadcast the situation, but the shift in perception was noticeable. I realized that by speaking my truth and seeking justice, I had not only protected myself, but also set a boundary that others recognized instinctively. It was empowering to feel that my experiences mattered, that they could no longer be ignored, and that I had created a space where my voice carried authority and respect. Each day, I moved through classrooms, hallways, and interactions with a growing confidence, understanding that courage and accountability extended beyond my immediate family and into the wider world. One afternoon, Officer Dalton visited again, not as an interrogator or investigator, but as a check-in on how I was adjusting. "Hannah," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, "you've demonstrated remarkable strength. The progress we've seen isn't just about the protective measures, it's about your willingness to assert yourself and insist on being heard. That courage will continue to serve you in ways you can't yet imagine." Her words resonated deeply, a reminder that the battles I had fought were not in vain. They had redefined not just my immediate circumstances, but also my understanding of self-worth, resilience, and the power of truth. I felt an overwhelming sense of validation, not only for the actions I had taken, but for the years I had endured, now seen through the lens of courage rather than victimhood. Lucas, constrained by both legal oversight and the unambiguous acknowledgement of his actions, began to retreat into a subdued silence. He no longer attempted the intimidation, the veiled threats, or the subtle manipulations that had characterized his behavior for years. My parents, in turn, seemed to accept the consequences of their prior inaction with a combination of regret and cautious compliance. The house was not yet healed. There were lingering resentments, awkward silences, and tense moments, but the most dangerous elements of control and abuse had been neutralized. It was a strange but profound relief to exist in a household where boundaries were respected, where my safety was no longer negotiable, and where the truth had forced a reckoning that could not be ignored. As the week progressed, I took small but meaningful steps toward reclaiming routines and activities that had previously been dominated by fear or avoidance. I began journaling again, a practice I had abandoned during years of suppression, and it became both a tool for reflection and a way to chronicle the newfound shifts in my life. I spent time with close friends, sharing fragments of my experience in measured doses, finding that acknowledgement from peers was both healing and empowering. Each conversation, each act of normalcy reinforced the sense that my world was no longer constrained by fear and secrecy. I was reclaiming not only my safety, but also my agency, my confidence, and my ability to envision a future beyond the shadow of abuse. By the end of the week, I felt the first real sense of equilibrium in months. The authorities' involvement had established boundaries that could not be ignored, and my own voice had become a source of authority in a way that reshaped every interaction in the household. I was aware of the fragility of this new balance and that ongoing vigilance would be necessary, but the contrast between the life I had endured and the one I was beginning to live was stark. I no longer felt invisible or powerless. I felt seen, validated, and capable of enforcing the boundaries necessary to protect myself. The transformation was not just external, it was internal.
Courage, once tentative and tested, had solidified into resilience, self-respect, and a sense of personal empowerment. One evening, as I settled into bed with my ribs propped carefully against pillows, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. From the initial moments of fear and denial, through the confrontation, documentation, and validation of my experience, to the current state of relative calm and safety, the arc of my struggle had been both painful and transformative. I realized that the most profound victory was not just the protective measures or the external acknowledgement, it was the reclamation of my voice, my sense of agency, and my belief in the power of truth to create change. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet but profound confidence that my life was my own, and that the courage to speak and insist on justice had reshaped my world in ways that were both empowering and enduring. The weeks that followed brought a transformation so profound that it was almost difficult to recognize the life I had once known. The immediate dangers had been mitigated, Lucas's behavior tempered by oversight and accountability, and my parents, though still grappling with the consequences of their prior neglect, had begun to navigate a path toward acknowledgement and cautious repair. I felt the first stirrings of freedom, not just from fear, but from the burden of invisibility that had shadowed my adolescence. My ribs, though still tender, had healed enough that the physical pain was a distant reminder rather than a constant ache. But it was the emotional and psychological healing that marked the true progress. I realized with quite astonishment that reclaiming my voice had reshaped not just my circumstances, but the very structure of my existence.
In school, the shift in my life resonated outwardly. I no longer walked the hallways with the weight of silence pressing on me. My posture was more assured, my voice steady when interacting with peers and teachers alike. Subtle signs of respect and recognition emerged where there had once been indifference. Friends who had noticed the changes in my behavior and demeanor began to approach me with curiosity, support, and even admiration. I realized that courage, once spoken and asserted, was not just a private victory. It radiated, affecting the way others perceived me and interacted with me. Each encounter reinforced my belief that speaking the truth, though costly, could fundamentally reshape relationships and environments in ways that were impossible to achieve through silence. At home, the tension that had defined the months prior gradually softened. Lucas, no longer shielded by denial or parental complicity, kept his distance, a tacit acknowledgement of the boundaries that had been established. My parents, though still learning how to navigate accountability, had begun to engage in conversations that were more measured and conscious, acknowledging my feelings without immediately resorting to defense or dismissal. The household, once a place of fear and suppression, became a space where dialogue, while cautious, was possible. I could finally envision living in a home where my experiences were respected, where my safety was prioritized, and where the lessons of the past could inform better choices for the future. The most profound aspect of the transformation, however, was internal. I discovered reserves of courage, resilience, and self-respect that I had not fully recognized before. Speaking the truth, enduring the backlash, confronting intimidation, and standing firmly in the face of disbelief had reshaped my understanding of who I was and what I was capable of. The act of reclaiming my voice became a defining marker of identity. I was no longer the silenced sibling trapped by fear and minimization. I was an active participant in my own life, asserting agency in ways that were both empowering and transformative. This internal shift, subtle yet immense, became the foundation upon which the next stages of my life could be built. One afternoon, I received a letter from Officer Dalton, summarizing the progress of the case and outlining the continued measures to ensure my safety and accountability for Lucas. Reading her words, I felt a quiet pride. The system had aligned with truth, and I had played an active role in asserting that truth.
The acknowledgement that my experience mattered, combined with the tangible steps taken to protect me, reinforced the reality that courage and persistence can force accountability, even in the face of long-standing denial and neglect. It was a validation that went beyond emotion. It was structural, concrete, and lasting. With time, I also began to explore ways to help others who might be experiencing similar situations. I started volunteering in a youth mentorship program at school, offering support to peers navigating conflict and family challenges. Sharing my experiences in a measured way, without fear of judgment, allowed me to transform past pain into guidance and empowerment for others. I realized that the full circle of transformation was not just surviving or reclaiming my life, it was using that reclaimed voice to help others navigate the difficult terrain of truth, courage, and accountability. Each small act of mentorship or support reinforced the significance of the journey I had endured, providing purpose that extended far beyond my personal vindication. By the end of the semester, I felt a profound sense of closure and empowerment. The transformation was complete not because the past was erased, it wasn't, but because I claimed ownership of my life, asserted my boundaries, and demonstrated the power of truth in the face of fear and resistance. My family dynamic, though altered and still navigating challenges, had shifted toward a balance where my voice could no longer be silenced and where accountability had become a visible, ongoing reality. I felt a renewed sense of agency and purpose, understanding that the courage to speak out had reshaped not only my life, but also the potential trajectory of others in similar circumstances. As I lay in bed one evening reflecting on the journey, I realized that the most important lesson was the enduring power of truth and self-advocacy. The act of confronting abuse, enduring backlash, and insisting on accountability had created a foundation of empowerment that could never be taken away. My life had transformed from a space of fear and suppression to one of agency, resilience, and hope. I knew that challenges would continue, but I also knew that the voice I had reclaimed was indestructible. The path ahead was mine to shape, guided by courage, validated by evidence, and strengthened by the knowledge that speaking truth is not just an act, it is a declaration of identity, empowerment, and enduring resilience. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.